This is Stan Murphy and my name is George Snow. We are interviewing Terry and Judy Howard on April 5, 2016 at the Chincoteague Museum. First of all, I would like to ask, Terry, would you please give us your full name, where you were born, and when?
My full name is Terry Howard. And the reason I don't have a middle name, and there's a good reason for it. When you're having two at a time, sometimes you don't have time for middle names. So anyhow, we're twins, and we had neither one of us had a middle name. My twin brother's name is Kerry. We were born on April the 2nd, 1938, on Ridge Road on a Saturday afternoon.
My full name is Judy Ann Berry Howard. I was born on South Main Street on Chincoteague Island, Virginia, on June the 28th, 1943.
And Terry, would you please tell me your parents' names and your grandparents' names?
Okay, my mother's name was Mary Mariah Daisy before she was married. She married my father, whose name was William Lee Howard. Her mother, my grandmother and grandfather on my mother's side was Melinda and James Daisy. On my father's side, it was Hilton and Bertha Howard.
My mother's name was Dorothy Virginia Daisy Berry. And my father's name was Robert E. Berry Sr.
Terry, we'd like to have you tell us about your work experience, what you did, and tell us about it.
Okay,
Work experience.
as far as working is concerned, my first money that I ever made as a child, in the way of spending money, we used to, a lot of the boys and some of the girls too as well, used to go over in the area where Tom's Cove is now. It was undeveloped, and there was a lot of wild blackberry bushes there. And we'd go over there, and especially in the month of June, when the big June berries were getting ripe, and pick blackberries, and we'd bring them home, carry them uptown in the carpet limits up there, and sell them for 30 cents a quart. Then later on, as I got a little bit older, and a little bit more able to do some things a little more complicated, my father taught my twin brother Kerry and myself how to plant a garden, which I still do to this day. And I remember the first things we ever planted was 3 things. We planted Kentucky Wonder string beans, we planted turnip greens, and we planted cucumbers. And we'd take them around the neighborhood and sell them to make spending money. And then at the time I got around 14 or 15-year-old, decided I wanted to get out on the water and catch clams and oysters like my father and grandfather and even my great-grandfather did before me. And I had a visual, I had a picture, an imaginary picture in my mind that it was going to be all fun and games. But I wasn't quite aware, nobody had filled me in about greenhead horseflies and sea nettles and things like that that hit you. And I found out that there's a lot of charm about working on water. It's a healthy way of making a living, but there was also some things that were negative that you had to learn to deal with. So we worked on the water with my father in the areas right around adjacent to Chincoteague, Shelley Bay, Salmon Easton Bay, and bays like that, which are in close proximity to where we're sitting today. You probably have read may have read some about it here in the museum, about people getting on boats and doing what they call going down the bay. There was a fleet of boats, and every boat had anywhere from 2 to 9 men on it. And Daddy put us on one of those boats. The name of that boat was a JWSE, and I'm going to say it the proper way, Bunting. That was the name of her. But people, Chincoteaguers called her the Razzle. They didn't give her exact name. They called her Razzle. And I remember Daddy and his brother owned a boat, and they took us down the bay, and we went as far south as South Bay, which is a good ways down the peninsula. One of the places that we went, one of the first places we ever went was in Hog Island Bay. You may have heard of Hog Island Bay or Hog Island Beach. There was a community on that island at one time. And I remember when they threw the anchor, we were in an area in Hog Island Bay called Hog Island Sink. And there was targets there, and the government used those targets for target practice. And we would clam all day, every day, just about most of the day. And then you weren't supposed to do it; it was illegal. But we'd do some clamming at night. You weren't supposed to do it, but it was against the law. But we'd do it. And I remember my father giving me a piece of just a plain old piece of cheese to eat. And before I got back to the boat that night, I had the heartburn so bad I didn't know what to do. But again, there was negative points in that too. And at night, I remember at night in Hog Island Sink, they found some pretty good climbing in that area, and there was a lot of boats that had congregated in that area. And at night, when all the workers, all the climbers, when they come back to the boats and they lit their lanterns, it looked like a little village in that sink, and I remember that. And it was a strenuous way of life, but healthy because you got a lot of good exercise. When you lay down at night, you could sleep like a log, and you could eat like a horse before you went to bed. And it was a good way of life. And I wouldn't trade the memories that I have and the experience that I had as a young boy, a youngster, or a young man. Learning the ways of a waterman and how to catch clams, how to catch oysters, and doing a lot of things on the water. I wouldn't trade it for the experience for anything.
And Terry, when you were doing this, Judy, what were you busy with?
Well, I was just a child at that time, just playing like any other.
Well, go ahead.
Now, what year did you?
When this was going, I was 16-year-old at the time.
Say it,
You can do the math. I'm 78 now, so.
Yeah.
No, I was just.
Okay.
I was just
She
a
was-
little girl
Judy,
playing with doll babies.
Did you ever work?
No,
never-
I was married when I
Just
was
made
15 and was a mother before I was 16,
You
and
wanna
I just
make
stayed home
biscuits?
and raised my child.
Okay. Well, we want to hear about the biscuits.
Let me tell her. I'll tell her.
Okay, you tell it.
But
Well, she's a pretty good cook. She is a good cook. She learned 15-year-old when we got married, but she soon learned to be a good cook, and she still is. And I remember I brought a friend home, without naming names, I brought a friend home one day with me, and she had just baked some biscuits. And she come to the window, we were sitting in the pickup truck, she come to the window, we were close to the window, and she asked me if he'd like to have a couple of biscuits. And he said yes. She reached a plate out the window to him and with 3 or 4 biscuits on it, and they were small, she makes a small biscuit, he was just popping in his mouth, one right after the other. And she said she was waiting for a compliment, but it didn't come. So she said, well, how are they? Did they taste good? He said, yeah, they're okay. Popped another one in his mouth. But she kind of got a little perturbed with him. She said, he's not going to get any more biscuits. He didn't give me a compliment.
no, I didn't know how to do, like when I first got married, I didn't know how to do much of anything at 15 years old. I had a lot to learn. And I had a lot of good teachers. So we would learn how to do, we would raise up a hog every year, and we'd slaughter them after Christmas, wasn't we would do that. And we done all the things ourselves. I made scrapple and sausage we done, and we done pig's feet, we done all kinds of things with that. So I come a long way. It wasn't the easy road, but I learned a lot from some nice people.
And who were some of these nice people?
Oh, they were
Relatives?
friends, and they were my family. I had 2 grandmothers that were excellent cooks, so I learned a lot, and my mother was as well.
The lady that taught us so much about making scrapple and making
Was
sauce,
Mrs. Ross,
Pansy.
this
She
lady.
was Pansy Ross before she got married.
Yeah, lady, I didn't know how to do scrapple. She came one evening and told me, what to do, how to prepare it, and she showed me. From then on, I could do it myself. So it was a lot of good teachers I had.
Okay, do you remember, both of you, answer about the flood of 1962?
Oh, yes.
What did you do and what happened during that?
You can tell them about
The
that
flood?
when you woke up. I should have brought a picture of the little house that
Did
we
you
were
leave
living
the
in.
island, or what did you do, or how did it?
Well, when this flood hit on in March the 6th, I believe it was, Ash Wednesday, they called it the Ash Wednesday storm. At the time, I was working at Burton Seafood, which was on East Side Drive. The tides were coming in even prior to this particular day, but we were due to go back to work that same day on March the 6th. And when I woke up that morning, we were living on a piece of property that had 3 chicken houses right in front of us. And you could look down between the chicken houses, each one of them. I could see my neighbor's house in his yard, and I saw water in his yard. I thought it must have rained heavy last night, and I was tired and I didn't hear it. So she was still in bed with her son, our young son. I went ahead and fixed me some scrap-on eggs, made me a cup of coffee, and I had breakfast. And then I looked down between those chicken houses a second time, and that water was about 100 or 150 feet closer. I said, hey, rainwater don't move like that. That's the tide. That's the tides coming in. And there's sort of a reservoir, I guess, or a holding place. It was right in back of us. And when that got full of the tide, when the tide filled it up, it overflowed and come up to the little house that we were living in. So I got her up, and she started to make preparations to get our son, get his clothes on so we could get out of that house, because it was situated almost on the ground, very low. It was only one block off the ground. And we went down to my father and mother's house, which was on somewhat of a knoll, a little bit higher elevation, and we waited down there. And this was March 6th. The water was still cold. I had hip boots on, which is what I used, one of the part of my apparel for working. It was part of, you had to have them to do the kind of work we were doing. I could have given her the boots, but if I had, she could not have walked in them. I know she couldn't have. They were hip boots, and she waded with just shoes on, and I had her son on my shoulders, and we managed to get down to my father's house, and his house was still dry, and we stayed there for the rest of that day and that night. And when the tide receded the next day, we found out that the helicopters were coming, and where they were going to land and where we needed to be in order to get on one and to evacuate the island. And it was just south of the intersection of Beebe Road and Ridge Road is where these helicopters were landing. And so we went down there and we got on a helicopter. And by the way, that was the first and only time I've ever been off the ground, unless I had to jump up. I never had flown before. And I remember we went over to NASA. I don't know whether NASA was in charge of that place then, or whether the Navy still had it. But at any rate, we went to NASA, and they put us up in one of those hangars. Had some places that we could lay down, and people came and looking for us, people that knew us, and same way with everybody. Our friends come looking to see if we needed things, and eventually the Red Cross moved in, and they started to feed us. And we stayed there, I guess, about a week or so, and then we come back home to see what we had left. And that little place that we lived in, before we left there that day, we took the chairs and put them in such a position that we could take the sofa and put a chair under each end of it to get it off on the floor and hopefully keep it dry. And that worked for the sofa, but our bed that we slept in, it had just a plain old cotton mattress. That was so waterlogged and so heavy, I didn't think I was ever going to get it out. But we got it out, and we managed to clean the mud up. The mud was all over everything. And people from the Salvation Army and the Red Cross, teachers that I had in school, or that we both had, they were more than good. They went past being good. They just went out of their way, and they let us know that they were there for us. And so we got through it, and it was an experience. And I also remember hearing my father talk about hurricanes and storms that took place in the 30s before I discovered America. And I thought, to be honest, I didn't tell him because I knew better. I thought he was exaggerating. But in 1962, when that storm hit, I found out not only was he not exaggerating, he was being conservative, because it was a rough time. When you see ocean-going boats in the middle of Main Street, not one but several of them, it takes a pretty bad storm to do that much damage. So, but we got through it and we learned from it, and it was quite an experience.
Do you have anything to add to that you really remember?
Not really. I mean, I think he's told you just about all it was. It was scary, you know? It was just, when we got over on the causeway where all the bridges are, and you look down, I mean, everything was just covered with
We could see the cars when we were going across the marsh that runs parallel with the causeway. We could see the cars where people had attempted to go across with the tide. The road was inundated, and they were like skeletons almost, just parked there, and nobody. Needless to say, they couldn't get them to start. They abandoned those, and I guess walked the rest of the way. But there were several cars on that causeway.
I'd like to ask, I understand that you had quite a bit of community involvement, council and so forth. Could you describe how you began your community involvement and how long you were involved with leading the community?
Well, I got started on the council. I was born and raised in the unincorporated part of the island. This was prior to annexation, or the boundary adjustment is really what it was. I grew up in the unincorporated limits. She grew up in the incorporated limits, and I told her we lived in country. She lived in the city where they had street lights and sidewalks. You know, she said, "Oh, I didn't have it any nicer than you did." But anyhow, as time went along, we bought this piece of property where we're living now, and it was just inside the corporate limits. And after we'd been there for a while, one of the town people that was on the council at the time was talking to my twin brother and said they needed somebody to serve on the town's planning commission. So he told my brother told him, he said, "Why don't you go ask my brother? He lives in the corporate limits." And by the way, my brother still lived in the unincorporated limits, so he couldn't serve. So anyhow, he sent him to me, and he come to me, and I was working, and he said, "Would you be willing to serve in a position on the town's planning commission?" Well, I had been out of high school for a number of years at the time. I graduated in 1957, several years, and I had, as I said a while ago, it was a healthy way of living. It was a peaceful way of living. It was demanding physically, but there was nobody out there saying, "You're not doing enough, you're doing too much, you're not doing a good enough job." It was nobody but you and the seagulls. You got no complaints. And then, but I told the man when he come to me, I said, "Let me think about it for a couple of weeks and come back and I'll give you an answer." And he came back in a couple of weeks. I never bothered to ask him what it entailed. I just assumed by way of its name, Planning Commission, it was part of the planning process for the community. So I told him, I said, "Yes, I'll do it." So I took that position, and after I'd been on it for 6 years, a fella came along, a friend of mine came along, he said, "Why don't you run for town council?" He said, I'll help you gather your signatures on your petition and things of that nature. And he said, "I'll help you any way I can." So I took his advice and his encouragement and filed the necessary papers and got on the town council. I stayed on the town council for 32 years. I served for 32 years, and that was my length of time. I saw a lot of changes, and I saw a lot of good things happen while I was there, not because of me, but because of a concerted effort on the part of the mayor and the whole council. I saw some good things happen.
Speaking of those changes, what do you think impresses you most about the changes on the island?
So that's a tough question, in
Yeah.
a way of speaking. Well, we grew up here again. Let me back up a little bit and say we grew up here on the island when there was only one day a year that we had a crowd of people. That was pony pinning, and after pony pinning, it was like they disappeared, and went into another world. But there was a lot of them, and I find out that as far as tourists was concerned, when I was a youngster, I remember seeing a sign in a fellow's yard one time, and it said tourists, and I thought, I wonder what they are. I was just a little boy, I didn't understand. But I find out as time went along, there was a lot more of them than was of us. The changes after pony pinning, and then when the book on on Misty of Chincoteague became a reality, Marguerite Henry had done her story, and it really put Chincoteague on the map, along with the annual wild pony swim that the fire company sponsors every year. It put us on the map, and from that point on, there was not just a sign hanging in the yard that said tourists. They were there with us, and you could see them, and there was a lot of them. But here's the positive thing about it. Our seafood industry at the time was sort of on the wane. The chicken industry had come and gone. We needed another industry of some kind to substantiate our economic base, and the tourist industry is what was what filled in the gap. And we were blessed in the fact that the people that come here, these tourists that I'm talking about, were family-oriented people. They came, they bought a lot of the houses, and some of them were people of means, and they fixed them up and made them look nice. They improved the community, they improved our economic base, and it was a win-win situation. And the most important thing, I said it first, is that they were family-oriented people, and they fitted in, and they didn't try to change us, they came and joined us. And it was a good thing.
I was wondering about if you have any favorite memories.
Oh, yes, I know one thing. How we entertained ourselves as children. Again, I was raised on Ridge Road, and at that time, there was a lot more of land that was full of big, I don't necessarily mean, I think it was virgin timber, but it was big wooded timber land. And especially the boys, and some of the girls played with us too. We would have our own imaginary games, and they were based on what we had heard our people talk about, what our people did for a living. One of those games was we pretended that we were in the chicken business, in the poultry business, and we'd go back in these wooded areas and clear us off a place, and our biddies, which is what some people call chicks, we call them biddies. We'd use pine cones, and this is probably less than pine burrs, we called them. We'd clear off this place around the tree, a circle around the tree, put those pine burrs or pine cones inside of it. They were our biddies. We'd go to a little area close by that was a little bit higher elevation, and when you dug down deep enough, the sand was yellow, which resembled the feed that you would give chickens in a real chicken house. We would take a Sears and Roebuck catalog or a Montgomery Ward catalog and take those green pages or yellow pages out and cut it up in strips, and that was our money. And that's the way we'd have buyers and we'd have sellers. We'd have buyers, we'd have growers, which ultimately became the sellers. And we'd pay for them with these strips of stuff that we cut out of catalogs.
That's fascinating. Thank you so much. I think we're out of
Okay,
time,
thanks.
though.
You go in such detail, say it takes time.
Well, everybody wants to know the whole story.
Yeah, well,
That was very
good.
interesting.
Okay.
I love it.
Good, that was very good.
All right, thanks.
So you got someone else that, many years ago. And it was a very easy recipe. You don't even have to mess your fingers up. You can do it like with a fork or a spoon, stir it with flour. You do your flour, your salt, your baking powder. Let's see, salt, flour, baking powder. And I put sugar in mine. My grandmother used to put sugar in her biscuits. I'll put a lot of sugar. And then you put shortening, Crisco, you can put Crisco, or you can use margarine. I use margarine in mine. I don't like a lot of oil. And milk, and just, you stir you work cut the butter in, the Crisco in with a knife or a little cutter. And then you add your milk. Add milk and just stir it with a fork. And I don't roll them like they used to years ago. They used to like put them in their hand and roll them. I lay them flat and cut them with a biscuit cutter.
There you
And
go.
it's easy recipe.
You missed the biscuits.
Yeah, well,
Hey,
I just,